Social media has done something quietly devastating to an entire generation of entrepreneurs. Not through bad advice exactly, not through outright lies, through something more subtle and more damaging, a relentless, algorithmically curated stream of arrival, of people who have made it, holding the thing they built, standing in the life they constructed, radiating the particular confidence of someone whose struggle is safely in the past and whose success is very much in the present. What social media almost never shows is the middle, the years between the idea and the outcome, the iterations that went nowhere, the version of the business that almost worked and then didn't, the periods of sustained, unglamorous, entirely unpostable effort that preceded every overnight success story by somewhere between 3 and 10 years. The magazine cover entrepreneur did not appear fully formed from a moment of inspiration. They persisted through a timeline that the cover does not show and the caption does not mention. And because the middle is invisible, an entire generation of builders has absorbed a timeline for success that is not real and is measuring their own progress against it, finding themselves behind and drawing conclusions about their potential that the evidence does not support. Carter drew those conclusions for 4 years, not because he lacked ability, because he lacked patience. And because every time the middle got hard enough to doubt, a new beginning was right there, clean and promising and free of the accumulated difficulty of the thing he was leaving behind. Stay with us, because today we are telling the story of a man who kept starting over, and the slow, costly realization that what he was running from was the only thing that could have taken him where he wanted to go. And if stories like this one matter to you, subscribe, because somebody out there needs to hear exactly this today. Carter was 31 years old and had started 4 businesses in 4 years. He would not have described this as a problem. He would have described it as rain. As the natural exploration of a person with broad interests and high standards, someone who tried things, assessed them honestly, and moved on when the evidence suggested a better opportunity elsewhere. He had a framework for each transition that sounded reasonable when he explained it and felt reasonable when he was living it. The market wasn't right. The timing wasn't right. The model needed more capital than he could access at this stage. The space was getting crowded. The explanations were not false exactly. There was always something in each situation that justified the leaving. But the explanations were also not the whole truth, and the part they left out was the part that mattered most. Carter left when things got hard. Every time. With enough justification assembled to make the leaving feel like strategy rather than retreat. The first business had been a streetwear brand launched at 27 with genuine creative energy, and a product that people who saw it responded to well. He had run it for 11 months before concluding that the apparel market was too competitive and the margins too thin for a bootstrapped operation to gain meaningful traction. He was not wrong about the competitive landscape. He was also 8 months away from a local stockist relationship that would have changed the trajectory entirely, though he did not know that when he left. The second had been a social media management agency, launched at 28 on the logic that the skills he had developed promoting his own brand could be sold to small businesses who needed them. He had signed 3 clients in the first 2 months and felt the specific excitement of early momentum. Then the work revealed itself to be more demanding and less scalable than he had projected. Client expectations proved difficult to manage, and one client had left after 4 months with a pointed email about unmet deliverables. Carter had closed the agency at the 10-month mark, not because it could not have worked, because it had become hard in ways he had not anticipated, and the hardness felt like a signal to stop rather than a problem to solve. The third and fourth had followed similar arcs, a food delivery concept that lasted 7 months, a fitness content platform that lasted 5, each one launched with genuine conviction. Each one abandoned before it had been in existence long enough to become something. Carter was not lazy. This was the thing that confused the people around him, and confused Carter most of all about his own pattern. He worked hard in the early stages of each venture, with an intensity and a focus that the beginnings of things reliably produced in him. The problem was not effort. The problem was that his effort had an expiration date that was set somewhere around the 9-month mark, when the novelty had worn thin and the work had revealed its true difficulty, and the results were not yet sufficient to validate the continuing sacrifice. He was a sprinter who kept entering marathons and dropping out at mile 4. The pattern became visible to him not through self-reflection, but through a conversation he had not planned to have. He was at a coffee shop working on the early planning stages of what he was already thinking of as his next venture, a corporate wellness platform, when he ran into a former acquaintance named Dennis, who he had not seen in 3 years. Dennis had been running a small e-commerce business selling specialty kitchen equipment when Carter had known him. A modest operation, not especially exciting, the kind of business Carter had privately assessed as lacking ambition. They talked for 20 minutes. Carter updated Dennis on his various ventures with the slightly defensive energy of someone who is aware, beneath the surface of the telling, that the story does not quite land the way he wants it to. Dennis listened politely. Then Carter asked what Dennis had been up to. Dennis said he was still running the kitchen equipment business. Carter kept his expression neutral. Dennis then mentioned, with the understated manner of someone who has not fully adjusted to a new reality, that the business had crossed 7 figures in annual revenue the previous year, that they had just signed a distribution agreement with a national retailer, that he had 2 full-time staff and was about to bring on a third. Carter sat with that for a moment. The business that had seemed unambitious 3 years ago had been running quietly, consistently, unglamorously for those 3 years, compounding. Not because it was a better idea than anything Carter had attempted, because someone had stayed with it long enough for the compounding to produce something visible. He drove home that evening and did something he had been avoiding for 4 years. He looked at his pattern honestly. Not the individual decisions, each of which had its own justification. The pattern itself, the shape of it, the consistent arc of high entry, sustained early effort, difficulty encountered, departure executed. He had been treating each business as a sprint with an indefinite finish line, running hard until the effort became unsustainable, and then stopping, framing the stop as a strategic pivot rather than as the exhaustion of a person who had not prepared for the distance the race actually required. He had never prepared for the middle. The middle, the 18 months to 3 years of sustained, unvalidated, unglamorous effort that preceded every success story he had ever admired, was the part he had been consistently leaving before he reached it. The part where the novelty was gone and the results were not yet arrived, and the only thing keeping a person moving was the decision to keep moving without the support of either excitement or evidence. That was the part that built things, and he had never stayed long enough to find out. The corporate wellness platform, the new thing he had been planning in that coffee shop, he put away. Not forever. But he went back to the fitness content platform he had abandoned at 5 months and looked at it with the honest question he had never asked before leaving. Not, is this working yet? But what would this become if I stayed for 3 years instead of 5 months? The answer, when he looked at it properly, was more interesting than he had given it time to become. He reopened it. Rebuilt the content strategy around what the 5 months of audience data had actually taught him rather than what he had assumed at the start. Committed to a timeline that was not defined by when results arrived, but by a minimum period of sustained effort, 2 years, non-negotiable, regardless of how the middle felt. The middle felt exactly as difficult as he had always left before finding out. He stayed anyway. 14 months in, the platform had an audience large enough to attract its first brand partnership. 20 months in, it had 3. By the 2-year mark, it was generating consistent revenue from a combination of partnerships and a paid membership tier he had launched at month 16. An idea that had arrived not in the excitement of the beginning, but in the quiet persistence of the middle, where the real understanding of what an audience actually needed had time to develop. It was not an overnight success. It was 24 months of showing up for something he had already quit once. There is no such thing as overnight success. This is not a comforting sentiment offered to people who are struggling. It is a structural truth about how businesses actually develop, through a timeline that social media edits out and magazine covers do not show, and highlight reels have no space for. The entrepreneurs you admire did not arrive. They persisted, through a middle that was hard and long and produced very little that was worth posting about, and on the other side of that middle, eventually, the thing that looked from the outside like it had happened quickly. The sprint is exciting. The beginning always is. The novelty, the energy, the clean possibility of something that has not yet encountered its own difficulty. These things are real and they matter and they are part of what makes starting worth doing. But starting is not building. Building happens in the middle. In the months and years after the excitement has normalized and the results are not yet visible, and the only reason to continue is the decision to continue. Carter spent 4 years leaving before the middle arrived. The day he stayed was the day he finally started building. Prepare for the marathon. Not because the sprint is not worth running, but because the finish line is much further than it looks from the starting blocks. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it today.